Airplane crashes are not very common occurrences in general, because aviation is the most developed area of transportation when it comes to leaving very little space to human error. However, when they occur, they might take the lives of dozens of people, if not hundreds. For this reason, whenever an airplane crash takes place, it is investigated and researched thoroughly by hundreds of professionals so that a similar occurrence won't take place again. From this perspective, we can say that aviation is an industry that learns from its mistakes. However, it is also actually very new to the world. It has just been over a century since the first airplane was flown, and it has only been 7 or 8 decades since civil aviation started. For this reason, the system is still not perfect, and accidents still occur that show we still have a long way to go to perfect the security of civil aviation. One of these accidents, one which left the biggest scar in aviation history and caused not only hundreds of casualties, but also the partial downfall of an aviation legend, Pan American Airlines. The Tenerife Airport disaster. The Tenerife Airport disaster has both an interesting and a heartbreaking story, and it still is one of the biggest moot points in aviation history. While we don't prefer to express an opinion in this video, we still think all aviation enthusiasts should know of this horrid disaster. For this reason, in this video, we are going to tell you the story of the Tenerife Airport disaster. On March 27, 1977, a bomb was set off in the terminal of Gran Canaria Airport by the Canary Islands Independence Movement, injuring 8 people. After this incident, a phone call was made informing the officials of a second bomb. After this phone call, most of the flights en route to Gran Canaria Airport that they were diverted to one of the neighboring airports, Los Rodeos, to prevent further damage. This bombing incident created a slight distress in Los Rodeos, since the infrastructure and usual traffic was not used to this level of density in the airport. Most of the airports in the area had only 1 or 2 runways, and this situation caused most flights to get suspended for hours. Tenerife Airport, which was just a few hundred kilometers west of the Gran Canaria Airport, was experiencing great distress in conducting flights and keeping up to the schedule. The airport only had 1 runway and 1 taxiway, which meant that it was very hard to keep up with the schedule. Additionally, there were also heavy category airliners, mostly Boeing 747s, that wouldn't normally be scheduled to fly to Tenerife, since, as we said, the airport was small and the only runway it had wasn't fit for such a traffic load. On a very tight schedule, the airport's ATC was struggling to instruct all the airplanes correctly at the same time. Fortunately, all airplanes diverted to Los Rodeos were successful at landing uneventfully. However, some of them had to park at the long taxiway since there wasn't any room left in the parking positions of the airport. Since some aircrafts were parked at the taxiway, the flights preparing for takeoff were forced to taxi on the runway. This is a procedure known as backtaxiing or backtracking. In backtaxiing, the airplane had to taxi on the runway and position itself by turning 180 degrees around at the end. A while later, the officials informed the flight crews that the bomb threat at the Gran Canaria Airport was contained and the airport was reopened for flights. After this information was passed, the ATC and flight crew started preparing for takeoff from Los Rodeos to reach their destinations, Gran Canaria Airport. One of the heavy airplanes, a Boeing 747 that belonged to Pan American Airlines, which was tagged as Pan Am Flight 1736, started preparing for takeoff from the only runway of Los Rodeos. However, the access to the runway was interfered by another Boeing 747 that belonged to KLM Airlines, which was tagged as KLM Flight 4805 and a refueling vehicle. Normally, the KLM airplane had enough fuel to take off and arrive at its next destination. However, to save time, the captain had decided to full refuel at Los Rodeos instead of Las Palmas. Since it wasn't safe to taxi around the KLM airplane, the Pan Am airplane wasn't able to reach the runway and take off. The fueling took about 35 minutes, and a further delay was caused by a family missing from the flight. The crew had to wait for a Dutch family of 4 to leave Los Rodeos. After the refueling was completed and the passengers got on board, the airport control tower instructed the KLM airplane to taxi along the runway and make a 180 degrees turn at the end. Later, it would get ready to take off from the runway. While taxiing on the runway, the airport control tower requested the KLM airplane to get ATC clearance. However, since the flight crew were performing the checklist, getting ATC clearance was postponed until the airplane got in takeoff position. Meanwhile, the Pan Am airplane was instructed to taxi on the runway following KLM and exit from runway to the long taxiway from the third connection. The flight crew had identified the first 2 exits. However, due to poor visibility with fog and ongoing discussion on whether they had passed the third exit or not in the cockpit, they missed the C3 exit. However, this was not only the flight crew's mistake, since there weren't any markings or signs indicating the numbers of the short taxiways. Los Rodeos is an airport that is approximately 650 meters above sea level. This means that the clouds that would normally be 600 meters above sea level were at the ground level in Los Rodeos. On a spectacularly cloudy day, this would mean poor to almost no visibility for aircrafts during takeoff. After the KLM airplane took position to take off, they asked for takeoff clearance from the ATC. ATC responded informing that the flight crew about directions and their route after takeoff, but didn't actually give clearance for takeoff. Or at least, they thought so. Hearing the word takeoff, the KLM flight crew advanced throttles and started increasing speed for takeoff. Meanwhile, the Pan Am aircraft was still trying to figure out how they could exit the runway. At last clearance, the flight crew informed the tower that they were at takeoff, which was interpreted by the tower as "we are at the takeoff position." However, the KLM aircraft was going to take off rather than being at the takeoff position with this clearance. Not being able to see the runway clearly due to dense clouds, the tower responded, "Okay, clearing for takeoff." As we mentioned, they also thought that they were informed that the aircraft was only at takeoff position. During this communication, the Pan Am flight crew informed the tower that they were still taxiing on the runway. However, this message was inaudible for both KLM and the control tower due to the interference caused by multiple radio messages being sent at the same time. Neither the control tower or the KLM cockpit was able to understand what the PM cockpit just said. If one of them had understood the message, this horrid disaster would have been prevented. After about half a minute, the KLM airplane started speeding up along the runway. At this point, the Pan Am aircraft said that they were still on the runway. The message was heard both by the KLM airplane and the control tower clearly this time. But the airplane had already started speeding up. While there was a possibility that it could have slowed down, the captain of the KLM aircraft proceeded with takeoff. Just when the Pan Am airplane was approaching the exit C4, the captain saw the landing lights of the KLM airplane. The airplane was approaching at takeoff speed, and the Pan Am crew knew exactly what was going on. The captain throttled the engines fully and made a sharp turn with the hopes of being able to exit the runway, but it was too late. The KLM airplane was able to partly take off. The nose of the airplane was clear from the Pan Am airplane, but the left wing and the engines were still in danger. Unfortunately, the captain of the KLM airplane was unable to increase altitude, causing the left wing of the KLM airplane to cut through the Pan Am 747. The KLM 747 was still partly airborne after the impact, but the engines on the left side were gone and it crashed about 20 seconds later. There were 248 people on board the KLM aircraft and 396 on board Pan Am. While there were no survivors on the KLM airplane, 61 of the people on board the Pan Am airplane survived with injuries. 583 people had died in the accident, marking the Tenerife Airport disaster as the deadliest aviation disaster of all times. Investigations following the incident found that all three sites, both airplanes and the tower, were found to be faulty. Further demonstrations and research found that the initial instructions for the Pan Am aircraft stating directions to exit C3 were practically impossible to carry out, since the aircraft would have to conduct two 148 degrees turns on the exit, creating a Z pattern. After the incident, an economical struggle started showing up on the Pan Am site, resulting in its bankruptcy in 1991, 14 years later after the incident. The disaster wasn't the only reason for Pan Am to go bankrupt, but it was mainly the reason the process started. Today, the Tenerife Airport disaster is still the deadliest aviation accident in history, even after roughly 55 years. And we hope that it stays that way forever. As Aviation File family, we offer our condolences to the relatives of the victims of the disaster and wish that this kind of accidents never happen again. We would be happy if you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. See you on the next video.